Here we are in the Harvard University archives.
Today we're going to look at one of those particularly fascinating, seemingly ephemeral objects. The kind of thing that doesn't often survive.
It's very fragile now, but once an everyday garment.
Right, with this very fine green gingham check.
Definitely cotton. With the fringe trim all the way around. There's both a button and a little snap or hook and eye. The seamstress has reinforced it somehow. It must have been worn quite a bit.
We also up here at the neck have this little tie, suggesting how it might have been closed. We have this drawstring in the back that allows a much tighter waist to be drawn around the middle.
It's definitely made entirely by hand. Beautiful tiny hand stitches. This on the selvage of the fabric, so there's no need to sort of finish a rough edge. But over here, overcasting to make sure there's no fraying.
So it's reinforced.
Oh, look at this. It's been reinforced on both sides where there might have been some stress or
as
some
this drawstring was pulled to create a waist.
Well, what is it?
When this was given to Harvard in 1939, it was given with a note. And the note reads that this toga, the toga is the word used, was worn by D.G. Haskins as a student here at Harvard College, as a sophomore, who graduated from Harvard in 1837.
David Haskins, a boy.
Samuel Eliot Morison, the great Harvard historian, didn't quite believe that this ever would have been worn by a Harvard student in the 1830s. And he wrote, it seemed far too sissy to be worn by those hard-drinking hellions of President Quincy's administration.
Josiah Quincy, the former mayor of Boston, had a lot of trouble with student unrest in the 1830s, building bonfires in the yard. When he clamped down on the students, they even hung him in effigy. They even had, interestingly enough, a kind of dress code that said the students were not to dress in female apparel. Do you think this is an example of rebellion?
I don't know, but just as we're doing today, Morison decided to do a little bit of research. And found some evidence that suggested, well, maybe in fact this did belong to such a student.
Right.
So first he turned to a memoir written by a young man who had graduated around the time when the owner of this supposedly had graduated around 1837. He described in this memoir that students walked around campus and walked around Cambridge wearing calico and gingham gowns.
The most wonderful and persuasive piece of evidence is this sketch here from a student named Samuel Longfellow. It in fact shows a young man in a gown much like this and with a straw hat strolling down the streets of Cambridge. So Morison was convinced. But you know, as historians, that's not quite enough. If we go back to the gown and look at it perhaps from the point of view of its maker. If we look over here at an excerpt from a needlework guide from very much the same period, we see a garment described as a dressing gown to be worn by men, women, or children.
Well, if this is a dressing gown that could be worn by men, women, children, why was it being worn, according to documentary evidence, on the streets of Cambridge in the 1830s?
Doesn't quite make sense unless it was deliberately transgressive. For a young man who was a student at Harvard to be walking around the village in this garment, it was making some kind of statement.
It makes me think of students today who are able to roll out of bed in their pajamas or their sweats and go to class, go about town, and in some ways it marks them as a college student.
What this reminds us, I think, is that it's not enough to just look at an object, and we have to think about how an object was used. A garment gets its meaning from the way it fits on a body and the way the person wears it. The combination of the straw hat and the dressing gown on the streets of Cambridge is telling us things that we cannot get just by looking at the object in isolation.
Learning more about the years in which David Haskins studied at Harvard can help us understand new layers of meaning.
1836 was an important year. It was the 200th anniversary of the college, and in honor of that occasion, President Quincy was inspired to write a history. He asked his daughter, Eliza, to do the illustrations. She did an amazing illustration showing the old yard as it would have been seen sort of from the edge of the Cambridge Common, looking across at the oldest buildings with the spires of the first church to the right, and with these very dignified procession of alumni in a circle parading in honor of the centennial. It's a pastoral image of a peaceful, almost bucolic scene.
It was in that church, under those Gothic spires, that Emerson, the very next year, delivers what could be considered an intellectual declaration of independence. He said we were no longer going to follow those courtly muses of Europe. He said that we were going to walk with our own feet, work with our own hands, speak with our own mind.
A celebration of individualism that was picked up by one of David Haskins' classmates.
He certainly was one of his classmates.
That's right, Henry David Thoreau.
Haskins was not a big fan of Thoreau when they were classmates here together. He described him as antisocial, he described him as aloof. He was not particularly impressed with this young man, but when he saw him a few years after they both had graduated, he was shocked, and he described him as having been transformed into something, and described that transformation as almost like a chemical reaction. That Thoreau had become now the man of Harvard, and for him the catalyst had been Emerson.
It's not surprising that Haskins thought of Emerson as the inspiration, because Emerson was Haskins' cousin. So suddenly this little gown that we think of as connected to somebody nobody remembers turns out to be quite intimately connected to two of the most famous men in Harvard history in the 1830s.
And that gives perhaps the subtle rebellion that David Haskins took part in a different kind of meaning.
We certainly haven't exhausted the ways of thinking about this garment. It's made of cotton in a period when cotton was becoming highly controversial. In 1837, the famous tour of Angelina Grimke to 67 towns in Massachusetts, provoking something like 20,000 women to sign petitions to end slavery, created a furor all through the Commonwealth.
Here at Harvard, there was a debate about slavery, which President Quincy did not approve of. He was worried that at an institute of learning, which drew students from all over the country, it would cause dissension, debate, discomfort on campus.
And of course, there were Southern students
Exactly.
at Harvard in that period, tuition-paying Southern students.
Exactly, and he was worried that students who were pro or anti-slavery, students from the North or the South, would not be able to deal with the differences they had over this issue.
There were, of course, the wealthy industrialists whose wealth depended on the manufacturing using Southern slave-grown cotton. A simple garment like this could end up as the center of controversy. But not, I think, for David Haskins in 1835 when he asked Madame Dana to make this article of clothing.
It was a choice to keep cool during the summer and perhaps to proclaim his identity as a Harvard student.
Things that we think of as major moments in American history intersect with the most common elements of everyday life. One way of understanding an object is to try to reproduce it. So we decided to try making a replica of the toga. And we made the decision to make it bright green rather than to try to make it look like the faded green that's been here for more than a century, and to use white trim rather than the old cream colored, because when it was new, it would have been bright green and it would have had white trim.
We have a wonderful volunteer, John Bell, who's agreed to model it for us. Button it up and get a sense of how it might have actually looked.
So you get that blousy
Yeah.
look, get that.
Yeah, let me
Sarah,
try.
we get the.
Now I see. Now I understand why it was reinforced.
All right, now, that's really an important part
Because look at how full.
of the style, so that we now have this full skirt. Now, it looks pretty good.
So when drawn in tight at the waist, we have this full skirt, these broad shoulders, much more like a silhouette you would expect to see
In the 1830s.
in the 1830s.
The hourglass shape of the 1830s.
Right. I actually found myself imagining David Haskins sitting by the banks of the Charles River on a warm summer day in his wonderful little gingham toga. Perhaps he has a book of poetry in there, a young romantic. Perhaps he has his journal. But I like to complete the picture by imagining him with a straw hat as
Yes.
well.
Great. Perfect touch.
Perfect.
Now you look like Samuel Longfellow's drawing.
But looking at it on someone makes this garment come to life in a way it doesn't in an archival box.